The copper smell hit me first, sharp and unmistakable, even in the alley's usual perfume of rot and stale beer. My sneakers splashed through something wet, and my stomach turned before my brain caught up with what that darkness on the pavement meant. Blood. Too much blood. The groan came from behind the dumpster, low and ragged, the sound of someone trying very hard not to make any sound at all. Every instinct screamed at me to keep walking, to pretend I heard nothing, to make it to the subway station 3 blocks away where fluorescent lights and crowds waited. Instead, I moved closer, my hand already reaching for my phone. He was slumped against the rusted metal, one arm pressed to his side where his shirt hung open and glistened black in the dim light. The other arm dangled useless, shoulder blooming dark and terrible. His head lolled forward, but I could see the sharp line of his jaw, the expensive cut of his suit, despite the blood soaking through it. Nobody wore a suit like that in this neighborhood. Nobody bled this much and stayed conscious. My nursing training kicked in before fear could stop me, that automatic assessment checklist running through my mind as I dropped to my knees beside him. Gunshot wounds, 2 visible entrance wounds front and back on the shoulder, possible through and through. The side wound looked worse, blood pulsing steadily. I pressed my hand against it and he jerked, his eyes snapping open. They were dark, so dark they looked black in the alley shadows, and they fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "He needs a hospital," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm calling an ambulance." His hand shot out faster than someone losing this much blood should be able to move, fingers wrapping around my wrist like an iron cuff. "No hospital." His voice was rough, each word costing him. "I'll pay. Whatever you want." I shook my head, already thumbing 911 on my phone. "You'll die without proper treatment." "I can pay," he repeated, and there was something in his tone that made me look at him again, really look. The quality of his shoes, leather that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The watch on his wrist, still visible despite the blood, heavy gold catching the distant streetlight. The way he held himself even collapsed and bleeding, like someone accustomed to being obeyed. The dangerous edge to his stare that said he was used to getting what he wanted through means I didn't want to imagine. "This is insane," I said, but my thumb hesitated over the call button. "You need surgery, antibiotics, imaging to see what damage." He opened his mouth to respond, and his eyes rolled back. His grip on my wrist loosened, and he slumped sideways. I caught him instinctively, his weight heavy against me, and felt his blood soaking warm through my scrubs. The phone screen glowed in my hand. I should call, I should run, I should do anything except kneel in this alley with a stranger who was either going to die or get me killed. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. I stared at his unconscious face and felt something crack inside me, that fundamental principle they drilled into us from day one of nursing school. Do no harm. First, do no harm. I couldn't leave him here to bleed out in an alley like garbage, no matter who he was or what he'd done to end up with bullets in him. My hands were already moving, checking his pulse at his throat, steady but weakening, his skin clammy under my fingers. I made my decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The clinic was only half a block back, the side door I'd exited still unlocked because Jerry the security guard wouldn't start his rounds for another 20 minutes. I ran, my sneakers slapping pavement, and slipped back inside, my breath loud in the empty hallway. The supply room lock was broken, had been for months. No budget to fix it. I grabbed what I needed with shaking hands: gauze, surgical thread, antiseptic, gloves, saline, anything I could carry. My mind was racing through procedures, through complications, through all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. When I returned to the alley, he was exactly as I'd left him, slumped and bleeding, and for one terrible moment, I thought I was too late. Then his chest moved, shallow but there. I knelt beside him again, tearing open packages with my teeth because my hands were trembling too badly for precision. The gloves went on. I poured saline over the wounds, trying to see through the blood. The shoulder was bad, but the side was worse, and I packed it with gauze, applying pressure, counting seconds. His blood soaked through warm and terrifying. I was cleaning the shoulder wound when his eyes opened again, those dark eyes focusing on me with a clarity that shouldn't have been possible. My hands froze. "You came back," he said, and his voice was stronger now, curious. "Why?" "Because I took an oath," I said, not looking at him, concentrating on threading the needle. "This is going to hurt." He watched me work, his gaze never leaving my face even as I began to stitch. I waited for him to flinch, to cry out, to react like a normal person would to a needle-piercing skin without anesthesia. He didn't make a sound, just kept staring at me with that unnerving intensity. "What's your name?" he asked. The question felt dangerous somehow. "Sarah," I lied. "Sarah Mitchell." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile. "No, it isn't." I met his eyes despite myself. "Yes, it is." "You're a terrible liar, Sarah Mitchell." He said the fake name like he was tasting it, finding it lacking. But I'll allow it for now. My hands steadied as I worked, muscle memory taking over. I'd stitched plenty of wounds before, knife fights and domestic violence and stupid accidents, but never like this. Never in an alley with a stranger who radiated danger like heat. His shirt hung open and I could see his chest as I moved to clean the area around the shoulder wound, could see the map of violence written on his skin. Scars, old and white and numerous, crisscrossing his ribs and abdomen. This wasn't his first time being hurt, wasn't even close. He'd survived things that should have killed him. "What do you do?" I asked, trying to distract myself from the implications. "That made you so many enemies." He was quiet long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "I protect my family's interests." The way he said interests made it clear what kind of interests he meant. I tied off the last stitch and sat back, exhausted. "You need antibiotics. Real medical care. I've done what I can, but infection." "I know," he interrupted. "Thank you." Two simple words, but the weight behind them felt enormous. I needed to clean the blood from his chest to check for additional wounds, my hands working mechanically even as exhaustion made my vision blur at the edges. His shirt was ruined anyway, expensive fabric shredded by bullets and soaked through, so I pulled it open further to expose his torso, looking for exit wounds or bleeding I might have missed. That's when I saw it. My hands stopped moving. Everything stopped. The tattoo covered his entire left pectoral, elaborate and unmistakable even in the dim alley light, black ink stark against his pale skin. A crowned raven with wings spread wide, talons clutching a sword, the detail so intricate I could see individual feathers. Latin words curved around it in an arc. Vis unita fortior, strength through unity, the motto I'd seen in newspaper articles and police reports and whispered warnings. The Ravenscroft family crest, the most powerful crime family in the city, the organization that controlled half the docks and most of the illegal gambling and protection rackets from downtown to the waterfront. The family whose war with the Colborne crew 3 years ago had turned Morrison Street into a battlefield. I was on my feet before I realized I'd moved, the gauze and antiseptic falling from my numb fingers. "No." The word came out broken. "No, no, no." He saw the recognition in my face, saw the horror, and his expression shifted into something wary and calculating. His hand reached for me again, but I was already backing away, my heel catching on the scattered medical supplies. "Sarah," he said, and hearing the fake name from his mouth felt obscene now. "Wait." I couldn't wait, couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the roaring in my ears. "Daniel." My brother's name was a scream inside my head. Daniel, who was 23 and working 2 jobs to pay for community college. Daniel, who took the bus down Morrison Street every Thursday night to his shift at the warehouse. Daniel, who died on the pavement with a bullet in his chest that wasn't even meant for him, just collateral damage in someone else's war. The Ravenscroft family war. I stumbled backward, and then I was running, my sneakers slapping against wet pavement, my breath coming in gasps that burned my throat. Behind me, I heard him call out, heard the sound of him trying to move and the grunt of pain as his injuries stopped him. I didn't look back. Couldn't look back. The supplies I'd risked my job to steal lay scattered in that alley, along with my medical oath and my naive stupidity. I'd saved him. I'd stitched his wounds with my own hands and worried about infection and felt sympathy for his pain. I'd saved a Ravenscroft. Saved one of the people responsible for Daniel bleeding out on Morrison Street while bystanders screamed and sirens wailed too late. My vision blurred with tears as I ran, the subway entrance a beacon ahead. Let him bleed out. Let him die in that alley like my brother died in the street. Let him suffer. But even as I thought it, even as rage and grief choked me, I knew the truth. He wouldn't die. His people would find him. Men like him didn't die in alleys. They survived and thrived and destroyed everything good around them. And now he knew my face. Knew I'd helped him. Knew I'd run when I saw who he really was. I didn't stop running until I reached the subway platform, my hands shaking so badly I could barely swipe my card. The train doors closed behind me, and I collapsed into a seat, staring at my blood-stained hands. His blood. Ravenscroft blood. What had I done? My apartment building looked the same as always, the cracked concrete steps and flickering hallway light fixtures suddenly feeling like sanctuary, and I took them 2 at a time, fumbling with my keys until I could slam the door behind me. The locks. I needed all the locks. Deadbolt, chain, the flimsy security latch that wouldn't stop anyone determined but made me feel fractionally safer. My hands were still shaking, blood dried under my fingernails. His blood, Ravenscroft blood. I leaned against the door and tried to breathe, tried to think past the panic clawing up my throat. He didn't know who I was. I'd given him a fake name, Sarah Mitchell, a name I'd pulled from nowhere. He might have seen my face, but there were millions of people in this city, thousands of nurses. No way he could track down one woman who'd stitched him up in an alley. Except he'd known I was lying. He'd looked at me with those dark eyes and said I was a terrible liar, said he'd allow it for now. For now. As if he'd already decided there would be a later. I pushed off the door and went to the bathroom, scrubbing my hands until the water ran clear, until my skin felt raw. My reflection in the mirror looked haunted, dark circles under my eyes, my hair falling out of its ponytail. I looked like someone who'd made a catastrophic mistake. I stripped off my scrubs and threw them in the trash, couldn't imagine ever wearing them again, then stood under the shower until the water ran cold. Sleep was impossible. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, jumping at every sound, every car engine on the street below, every footstep in the hallway. Dawn came eventually, gray light filtering through my thin curtains, and I dragged myself upright. Work. I had a shift in 3 hours. Normal routine, normal life, everything would be fine. The clinic waiting room was already full when I arrived, the usual chaos of understaffing and too many patients. Doctors Margaret Thornhill caught my arm as I headed to the nurses' station, her sharp eyes taking in my appearance with obvious concern. "Eleanor, are you all right? You look exhausted." "I'm fine," I lied, the words automatic. "Just didn't sleep well." She studied me for another moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, we're swamped as usual. Room 3 needs vitals, and Mr. Chen's wound dressing needs changing in 5. I threw myself into work, taking blood pressures and temperatures, administering medications, changing bandages, All the familiar tasks that should have grounded me. Instead, I kept seeing that tattoo, that crowned raven, kept feeling the texture of his skin under my hands as I'd stitched him. Every time the clinic door opened, I tensed, expecting him to walk through, expecting his men. Outside the window, a dark sedan rolled past and my heart stopped. But it kept going, just someone driving down the street. Catherine called during my lunch break and I stared at her name on the screen, unable to answer. She'd want to meet for coffee like we did every week. Would take one look at my face and know something was wrong. I let it go to voicemail, sent a text. Swamped at work. Rain check? Her response came immediately. 3 question marks. Then fine, but you owe me details. There were no details I could give her. No way to explain that I'd saved a mob underboss's life and run when I realized who he was. No way to make sense of any of it. I finished my shift in a fog of exhaustion and paranoia, checking over my shoulder as I left the clinic, searching for dark sedans and dangerous men with knowing eyes. 3 days passed and nothing happened. No men in dark suits appearing at the clinic. No threatening phone calls, no cars following me home through the rain-slicked streets. I started to breathe easier, started to think maybe I'd been paranoid, maybe he'd been too injured to remember my face clearly, or maybe the blood loss had made everything fuzzy and indistinct in his memory. Maybe he was dead. The thought appeared in my mind on the 3rd night as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and it disturbed me more than it should have, sent something cold and uncomfortable through my chest. I didn't want him dead. Didn't want to picture him bleeding out in that alley after I ran, alone and in pain, those dark eyes closing for the last time. He was a Ravenscroft. He was part of the organization that had killed Daniel. I should want him dead, should feel nothing but satisfaction at the idea. Instead, I kept seeing the way he'd looked at me while I stitched his wounds, that unwavering stare even through agony, the slight curve of his mouth when he'd said I was a terrible liar. The 4th day I actually managed to focus at work, managed to take care of patients without jumping at every shadow, managed to laugh at something Dr. Thornhill said about the broken autoclave. Normal. Everything was going back to normal. I left the clinic at 6 as the sun set behind the buildings, turning the sky orange and purple, my bag slung over my shoulder and my keys already in my hand. The black car sat at the curb directly in front of the entrance, sleek and expensive and completely out of place in this neighborhood of cracked sidewalks and failing businesses. My steps faltered. The rear window rolled down with a smooth mechanical whisper, and there he was. Alexander Ravenscroft sat in the back seat, looking immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, his shoulder clearly bandaged under the fine fabric, but otherwise appearing completely recovered, his dark hair styled back from his face, his expression calm and controlled and focused entirely on me. "We need to talk," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between us. I ran. Turned on my heel and bolted back toward the clinic entrance, my heart hammering against my ribs, my breath coming in gasps. I made it maybe 10 feet before 2 men stepped out from beside the building, not rushing, not threatening, just standing in my path with their hands clasped in front of them, like security guards or bodyguards or whatever these people called themselves. I spun the other direction and there were 2 more, same posture, same calm expressions. They weren't touching me, weren't even reaching for me, but they were immovable as walls. "Eleanor," Alexander said from behind me, and hearing my real name from his mouth made my blood turn to ice. Not Sarah. Eleanor. He knew exactly who I was. "Please get in the car." His tone was polite, reasonable, the kind of voice someone used when they were being patient, but wouldn't be patient forever. I turned slowly to face him, my keys digging into my palm where I clutched them. One of the men opened the car door wider, a silent invitation that felt more like a command. I looked at the clinic windows, at the pedestrians walking past with their eyes carefully averted, at the normal world that suddenly felt very far away. Then I walked to the car and got inside because what other choice did I have? I pressed myself against the far door of the car as it pulled smoothly away from the curb, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Alexander Ravenscroft. Though the space was limited and his presence seemed to fill every inch of the leather interior. He sat on the opposite seat, angled slightly toward me, but not crowding, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his posture relaxed in a way that made the tension coiling through my body feel even more pronounced. The car smelled of expensive cologne and leather, and something else, something dark and indefinable that made my heart race. "I want to thank you," he said after a moment of loaded silence, his voice low and measured. "You saved my life 4 nights ago, and I owe you a debt." "I don't want anything from you," I managed, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "I want to be left alone. I want to go back to my life and pretend none of this happened." His dark eyes studied me with that same unnerving intensity I remembered from the alley, and I had the uncomfortable sense that he was seeing past every defense I tried to construct, reading things in my expression I didn't want to reveal. "That's not possible now," he said, and something in his tone made my stomach drop. "You were seen helping me that night. There were witnesses, people who work for a man named James Colborne, a rival of my family. They saw you stop, saw you treat my wounds, saw you save me when you could have let me die or called the police." I stared at him, my mouth going dry. "So what? So they'll assume you're connected to me. They'll assume you matter." His jaw tightened slightly, the first sign of emotion breaking through his controlled exterior. "And they'll use you to get to me if they can." The cold fear that had been sitting in my chest since I'd seen that tattoo spread through my entire body. "This is insane," I said, hearing the edge of hysteria in my voice. "I'm not connected to you. I don't even know you. I was just doing my job, helping someone who was injured. Tell them that. Tell them I'm nobody." His expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy if it weren't coming from a man who had people killed for a living. "They won't believe it, and even if they did, they won't care. You're leveraged now whether you want to be or not. The only way to keep you safe is to keep you close, to make it clear you're under my protection." I laughed, the sound bitter and harsh in the enclosed space. "I felt safer before I met you, before I knew what you were." He didn't flinch, didn't look away, just continued watching me with those dark, calculating eyes. "I know," he said quietly, "but we don't always get to choose our circumstances, only how we respond to them." The car turned onto a bridge, the city lights reflecting off the water below, and I realized I had no idea where we were going, no idea what was going to happen next. I was trapped in a car with a dangerous man whose life I'd saved. A man who claimed he wanted to protect me from consequences I'd never asked for. Consequences that existed because I'd done the right thing. I pressed my forehead against the cool window glass and tried not to cry, tried not to think about how completely my world had just shattered. The building rose into the night sky like a monument to wealth and power, all glass and steel in sharp modern lines that reflected the city lights in fractured patterns. The car descended into an underground garage where other expensive vehicles sat in neat rows, and Alexander's men opened the door for me with the same practiced efficiency they'd shown blocking my escape earlier. I followed him into a private elevator, my reflection staring back at me from the mirrored walls, pale and wide-eyed, and completely out of place in my worn scrubs and practical jacket. The elevator rose so smoothly, I barely felt the movement, numbers climbing past residential floors until we reached the top. The doors opened directly into the penthouse apartment, and I stepped out into a space that belonged in magazines I'd never be able to afford. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the entire city, a sprawling view of lights and darkness that made me feel dizzy with the height and the unreality of it all. The furniture was modern and masculine, leather and dark wood and clean lines, expensive art on the walls that I didn't recognize but knew instinctively cost more than I made in a year. Maybe more than I'd make in 10 years. 2 men stood near the windows, the same calm professional posture as the ones who'd blocked my path, and Alexander spoke to them in a low voice I couldn't quite hear. They nodded and left through the elevator, leaving us alone in the vast space. I stayed near the door, my back almost touching it, ready to bolt, even though I had nowhere to go and no way down except the elevator that required a key. He moved to a bar area near the windows. All crystal decanters and expensive bottles arranged like an art installation, and poured amber liquid into a heavy glass. Scotch, probably, something aged and rare. He held up a second glass in silent offer, but I shook my head, wrapping my arms around myself. I don't want a drink. I want answers. He took a slow sip, watching me over the rim of the glass with those dark, unreadable eyes. What do you want to know? Why did you run when you saw my tattoo? What do you know about my family? Only what everyone knows, I said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. Rumors, stories, things people whisper about. His expression shifted slightly, something that might have been amusement or disbelief. You're still a terrible liar, Eleanor. He set the glass down and took a step closer, and I pressed harder against the door. The way you looked at me that night, the fear in your eyes, that wasn't general knowledge, that was personal. What happened? Who hurt you? No one hurt me, I said quickly, too quickly, and saw his eyes narrow. Your family hurt me. Your organization. Your war. He went very still, the kind of stillness that predators have before they strike, and I realized I'd said too much, revealed exactly what I'd been trying to hide. Tell me, he said, his voice dropping into a register that made something cold slide down my spine. Tell me what we did. He moved closer and I had nowhere to go, my shoulder blades pressing against the door, my hands flat against the wood as if I could somehow push through it and escape. His footsteps were silent on the expensive floor, his approach deliberate and controlled. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something low and dangerous that made my pulse hammer in my throat. Tell me what we did, he repeated, and I felt something break inside me, all the careful control I'd been maintaining since that night in the alley shattering like glass. My brother, I said, the words coming out harsh and jagged. Daniel Ashford. He was killed 3 years ago on Morrison Street. Wrong place, wrong time. He was walking home from his shift at the restaurant where he worked, just trying to get home, and he got caught between your soldiers and the Colborne crew. Caught in the crossfire of a war that had nothing to do with him. A war he didn't even know existed until bullets started flying. Alexander stopped moving and I saw something shift in his expression. Recognition flashing across his features, followed by something that looked almost like pain. Morrison Street, he said quietly, and it wasn't a question. The March incident. The ambush on the supply route. I watched his face and saw the memory forming, saw him placing the pieces together. There was a civilian casualty that night, a young man. He stopped, his jaw tightening. Your brother. My baby brother, I said, and hated how my voice cracked on the words. He was 23 years old. He'd just gotten engaged. He was going to start nursing school in the fall because I'd convinced him he'd be good at helping people. And he died on a sidewalk because your people and Colborne's people decided that corner belonged to one of you. Alexander took a step back, giving me space I desperately needed, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected. Genuine regret. Not the calculated sympathy of someone offering empty condolences, but real recognition of damage done. I remember that night, he said, his voice rough. I wasn't there, but I saw the reports afterwards. We pulled back our operations in that sector for 2 months out of respect. I know that means nothing to you. It doesn't bring him back. He's right that it means nothing, I wanted to say, wanted to scream at him that his respect and his pullback and his regret were all worthless against the weight of Daniel's absence. But I found myself staring at him and seeing something I hadn't expected to see in a man like him. Actual remorse. Not performative guilt, but the kind of bone-deep regret that comes from understanding the true cost of violence. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words sounded inadequate even as he spoke them. "I know that doesn't change anything. I know you have every reason to hate me, to hate my family, to want nothing to do with any of this world. But I am sorry, Eleanor, for what happened to your brother, for the pain my family's choices caused you." I didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to process a Mafia underboss offering what seemed like sincere condolences for a death his organization had caused. My hands were shaking, and I pressed them harder against the door, needing something solid to anchor me. "Why did you bring me here?" I asked finally. "If you knew I had reason to hate you. Because keeping you safe matters more than whether you hate me," he said simply. The tension in the room shifted then, becoming something different and more complicated than the raw emotion of moments before. And Alexander moved back toward the windows, creating distance that felt both respectful and strategic. "The man who shot me 3 days ago was James Colborne," he said, his voice taking on a different quality, more businesslike but still carrying an undercurrent of something darker. "He's a lieutenant in a rival organization that's been making moves against Ravenscroft territory for the past 6 months. The ambush was meant to take me out, eliminate someone they see as an obstacle to their expansion." He paused, looking out at the city lights spread below us like a carpet of stars. They failed, obviously, but not before several witnesses saw what happened. "Saw you helping me." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What does that mean?" "It means that Colburn and his people know you exist," he said, turning back to face me. "They saw a woman provide medical aid to their target, saw you save my life when I should have bled out in that alley. They'll assume you're connected to me. An asset, a weakness they can exploit." My hands had gone numb. "I'm not connected to you. I helped a dying man because that's what I do. That's my job." "I know that," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone despite the harsh reality of his words. "But they don't. And even if they did, it wouldn't matter. You're a liability to them now because you kept me alive, and you're a potential victim because hurting you hurts me. Or so they'll believe." He crossed his arms, the movement highlighting the breadth of his shoulders, the controlled power in his frame. "I'm assigning you a protection detail. 2 of my best men. They'll keep their distance, but they'll be watching, making sure no one from Colburn's crew gets near you." I pushed off from the door, anger flooding through me, hot and sharp. "No, absolutely not. I'm not having your thugs following me around, watching my every move, turning my life into some kind of surveillance state. This is exactly what I was afraid of when I saw that tattoo. Getting pulled into your world, losing my freedom, becoming a prisoner." "You're not a prisoner," he said, and his voice had gone hard, unyielding. "You're under protection. There's a difference, and it matters, Eleanor, even if you can't see that right now. A prisoner has no choices. You have choices, just within parameters that keep you breathing." The bluntness of it hit me like a physical blow. Within parameters, as if my entire life could be reduced to acceptable risk levels and security protocols. I wanted to scream at him, wanted to rage against the unfairness of being dragged into consequences for an act of basic human decency. But I could see in his eyes that he wasn't going to negotiate on this, wasn't going to let me walk out of here without protection, no matter how much I argued. He moved closer again, not crowding me, but close enough that I could see the absolute certainty in his expression. "I know you hate this," he said quietly. "I know you want your normal life back, want to pretend that night never happened. But it did happen. And now we both have to deal with the reality of what that means. I will keep you safe, Eleanor, whether you want me to or not. I want to go home," I said. And I hated how small my voice sounded, how defeated, but I needed something familiar, some piece of my old life to prove it still existed. Alexander studied me for a long moment, something unreadable crossing his features, and then he nodded once, sharp and decisive. "All right," he said. I'll have Marcus and Torres take you. They'll maintain distance, but they'll be watching your building, watching for any sign of Colburn's people. I wanted to argue, wanted to refuse the guards and the surveillance and everything this new reality represented, but fear had settled into my bones like cold water, and I found myself nodding, accepting protection I'd sworn I didn't want. The drive back to my neighborhood felt surreal, the transition from his world of penthouses and power back to my modest corner of the city, highlighting just how far I'd fallen into something I didn't understand. Marcus and Torres were silent professionals, their presence both comforting and suffocating. And when we pulled up outside my building, I practically fled from the vehicle, desperate for the sanctuary of my own space. I climbed the stairs to the third floor, my keys already in my hand, and something felt wrong before I even reached my door. It hung slightly open, the frame splintered around the lock, and my heart stopped completely. I should have run back downstairs, should have called for the guards, but instead I pushed the door open with trembling fingers and stepped into devastation. My apartment had been destroyed. Furniture overturned, cushions slashed, books and belongings scattered across the floor like the aftermath of a hurricane. My grandmother's lamp lay shattered near the window, photographs torn from frames. The small television I'd saved for months to buy smashed beyond repair. I moved through the wreckage in a daze, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing, and then I reached my bedroom and saw the message, spray painted across the wall in harsh black letters. Tell Ravenscroft we're coming. I couldn't breathe. My lungs had stopped working, my chest tight and my vision tunneling, and I heard a strange gasping sound that I distantly recognized as coming from me. Strong hands gripped my shoulders, and I spun to find Marcus there, his weapon drawn, his eyes scanning the room with professional efficiency. Torres was speaking rapidly into his phone, and I caught fragments of words through the rushing in my ears. Intrusion. Message. Send him now. I sank down onto the edge of my destroyed mattress, my hands shaking so badly I had to clench them together, and the reality of Alexander's warnings crashed over me with suffocating weight. This wasn't theoretical danger anymore. This wasn't protection protocols and security parameters. This was real people who knew where I lived, who had been inside my home, who had touched my things and left their threats on my walls. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had lost all meaning. And then I heard footsteps and looked up to find Alexander standing in my doorway. He took in the destruction with a single sweeping glance, his expression going absolutely cold, the kind of cold that spoke of violence barely restrained. And when his eyes found mine, something shifted in his face. He crossed to me in 3 strides, crouching down so we were eye level, and his hand touched my shoulder with unexpected gentleness. "You're moving to a secure location tonight," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Pack whatever survived that matters to you." I was too shaken to protest, too frightened to maintain the illusion of independence, and when he added softly, "I promise you, Eleanor, no one will hurt you," I found myself believing him. The drive out of the city took 40 minutes, and I watched through tinted windows as the urban landscape gradually gave way to suburbs and then to something more rural, estate walls appearing between stretches of manicured greenery that spoke of wealth I could barely comprehend. When we finally turned through iron gates that opened automatically at our approach, I caught my breath despite my determination not to be impressed. The estate sprawled before us like something from a movie, all stone and symmetry and elegant architecture, with grounds that seemed to stretch forever into carefully maintained wilderness. Armed guards were visible at strategic points, their presence both reassuring and deeply unsettling, a reminder that this beautiful place was also a fortress. Alexander helped me from the car with unexpected courtesy, his hand warm against mine for the brief moment of contact, and then he was leading me up marble steps into an entrance hall that made me feel impossibly small and out of place. The guest suite he showed me to on the second floor was bigger than my entire apartment, all cream and gold with furniture that probably cost more than I made in a year, a bathroom with a tub I could practically swim in, and windows that looked out over gardens lit by subtle landscape lighting. "It's too much," I said, my voice sounding strange in the elegant space. "I don't need all this. You need to be safe," he replied, standing in the doorway as if reluctant to invade my space even in his own home. "Everything else is just details." He showed me around the estate then, his presence at my side steady and strangely grounding despite the unreality of the situation. The library held more books than I'd seen outside an actual library, floor-to-ceiling shelves in a room that smelled of leather and old paper. The gym looked professional grade, equipment I had no idea how to use gleaming in precise rows. The pool glowed aquamarine in its glass enclosure, steam rising from heated water. The gardens stretched into artful darkness, paths winding between sculptured hedges and flower beds that would be spectacular in daylight. "You can go anywhere on the property," Alexander said as we stood on a terrace overlooking the grounds. "The perimeter is secure." "My men know you're under protection. You're not a prisoner here, Eleanor." I wanted to argue that the distinction felt meaningless when I couldn't leave, but the memory of my destroyed apartment was too fresh, too frightening. "He'll stay here too," he added, something in his tone making me look at him. "While the threat is active, easier to coordinate security." I realized then that he was restructuring his entire operation around keeping me safe, and the weight of that responsibility sat heavy in my chest. "What do you need?" he asked, practical now. "From your life, work, friends, obligations. We'll need to manage your absence." The word absence made it sound temporary, manageable, not like the complete upheaval it felt like. "I need to call my work," I said. "Dr. Thornhill will be expecting me tomorrow. And Catherine, my best friend. She'll worry if I disappear." He pulled a phone from his pocket, different from the one I'd seen him use before. "Secure line," he explained, handing it to me. "Make whatever calls you need." I took the phone with trembling fingers and dialed the clinic first, my mind scrambling for believable lies as Dr. Thornhill answered. Dinner was announced by a soft knock at my door at 7 that evening, and when I emerged from my suite wearing borrowed clothes that fit so perfectly, I suspected Alexander had somehow known my exact measurements. I found him waiting at the base of the grand staircase, looking like something from a different world entirely. He'd showered and changed into dark slacks and a charcoal sweater that made his shoulders look impossibly broad. His still damp hair brushed back from his face in a way that revealed the sharp lines of his features, and when his eyes traveled over me, there was something in his expression that made my breath catch, despite everything. The dining room was formal in a way that made me acutely aware of my community clinic salary and second-hand furniture life, all crystal chandeliers and mahogany and place settings with more forks than I knew what to do with. But the meal itself was surprisingly simple: roasted chicken and vegetables prepared by a chef I never saw, but whose skill was evident in every bite. We sat at one end of the long table, close enough for conversation, but with enough distance to feel safe, and for the first several minutes we ate in awkward silence broken only by the clink of silverware against china. He broke it first, asking about my work in a tone that suggested genuine interest rather than polite conversation filler, and I found myself talking about the clinic, about patients who couldn't afford care anywhere else, about the satisfaction of helping people who had nowhere else to turn. I heard the pointed edge in my own words, the implicit contrast between healing and the harm his world dealt in. But he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he set down his fork and told me about his sister, about how she'd been sick as a child with something the doctors initially couldn't diagnose, about weeks in the hospital watching her suffer while their father raged impotently at his inability to fix it with money or power. "The nurses," he said quietly, "were the ones who actually helped. They sat with her when she was frightened. They made her laugh. They treated her like a person instead of a problem to solve." His voice carried something raw and unguarded, and I saw past the dangerous exterior to someone who understood what I did mattered, who valued it in a way that surprised me. I asked about his sister now, and his expression softened in a way that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and almost approachable. "She's well," he said, "studying art history in Florence. Sends me photographs of paintings I don't understand and lectures about Renaissance techniques." He smiled slightly, affection clear in every word, and I realized this brutal man had someone he loved enough to let himself be vulnerable about. We talked more easily after that, conversation flowing into books and music, and the kinds of small discoveries that build connections between strangers. And I caught myself laughing at his dry observations about the opera his business associates dragged him to, the way he described sitting through 4 hours of what he called theatrical yelling, while planning security protocols in his head. The laughter felt like betrayal of everything I believed about him and his world, but it also felt startlingly natural. And when dinner ended and we moved to a less formal sitting room for coffee, I realized with unsettling clarity that I'd enjoyed myself, that the evening had felt less like captivity and more like something dangerously close to a date. Days slipped past in a strange rhythm that felt both surreal and oddly domestic, and I found myself settling into patterns that should have felt more like captivity, but instead began to feel almost comfortable in ways that disturbed me. Mornings I spent exploring the grounds, walking paths that wound through gardens bursting with late summer blooms, sitting by the pool with books from the library, while armed men maintained discreet distances that let me pretend at normalcy. Alexander worked from a home office in the East Wing, and I'd catch glimpses of him through windows as I passed, always on the phone or studying documents with that intense focus I'd first seen in the alley. And I told myself I wasn't timing my walks to coincide with these glimpses, but I knew I was lying. We shared meals, lunch and dinner becoming anchors in the day, and our conversations deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated, revealing that he was educated and well-read and not at all the brutal thug I'd expected. His insights into literature and history surprising me, until I caught myself laughing at his dry observations about Machiavelli's relevance to modern business practices, the kind of humor that made me forget momentarily what his business actually entailed. Physical awareness built between us like static electricity, the way his eyes would linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way I noticed everything about him now, his hands when he reached for his coffee cup, the timbre of his voice when he said my name, the way he moved through space with that controlled grace that spoke of violence held in check. Catherine called repeatedly on the secure phone, her worry bleeding through even the careful lies I constructed about a family emergency that kept me away, and the guilt of deceiving my best friend weighed heavier with each conversation, until I found myself crying in the library one afternoon, overwhelmed by the impossibility of my situation and the knowledge that my real life was continuing without me in ways I couldn't control. I didn't hear Alexander enter, but suddenly he was there, sitting beside me on the leather sofa with careful distance between us, not touching, but his presence somehow steadying, and we sat in silence while I struggled to compose myself, and he simply waited with a patience I hadn't known he possessed. He asked finally if I wanted to talk about it, and I shook my head, unable to articulate the tangle of fear and guilt and confusion and this other thing I refused to name that made my heart race when he was near. He told me then that this wouldn't last forever, that his people were working to resolve the situation, that I'd go home soon and return to my life, and his words should have comforted me, but instead they felt like loss, like something ending before it had properly begun, and I realized with startling and terrifying clarity that part of me didn't want to leave, didn't want to return to the world where he didn't exist in my daily landscape, and that realization was more dangerous than anything Colburn could do to me, because it meant I was falling for a man whose world had killed my brother, whose hands were stained with violence I couldn't ignore, whose very existence contradicted everything I believed about healing and helping and doing no harm. The alarms shattered the quiet of the estate at 2 in the morning, piercing shrieks that yanked me from uneasy sleep into immediate terror, and I was still trying to orient myself in the darkness when my bedroom door burst open and Alexander appeared backlit by hallway lights with something dark and angular in his hand that I realized with a jolt was a gun. He moved with precision and speed that was almost inhuman, crossing to me in 3 strides and pulling me from the bed with a hand around my wrist. His voice clipped and cold in a way I'd never heard as he ordered me to come with him now, no questions. And I stumbled after him in my borrowed nightgown, seeing the transformation from the man who'd sat beside me in the library to someone else entirely. Someone operational and dangerous and utterly focused. The hallway outside erupted with movement, his men appearing from various positions with weapons drawn and communications devices pressed to ears. Speaking in terse code I couldn't decipher, and Alexander moved through the chaos like he'd choreographed it, one hand still gripping my wrist while the other held his weapon with casual competence that spoke of extensive training and experience I didn't want to imagine. We reached a door I'd never noticed before, hidden in the paneling near the library, and he produced a key from somewhere and opened it to reveal a staircase descending into reinforced concrete walls that looked like they could withstand anything. The safe room he'd mentioned, but I'd never actually seen. And he guided me down with a hand on my lower back that was gentle despite the urgency. The space below was larger than I expected. Maybe 15 feet square with its own ventilation system and banks of monitors showing security camera feeds from around the property. And on one screen, I could see a dark figure moving near the eastern perimeter wall, while armed men converged from multiple angles. Alexander positioned me in the corner furthest from the door, his body between me and any potential threat, and I could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his jaw was set as he watched the monitors with absolute concentration. And I realized I was seeing him as he truly was in his world, not the almost domestic version who'd shared meals and conversation, but the underboss who commanded soldiers and made life and death decisions without hesitation. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might crack my ribs and my hands shook, but I couldn't look away from him, from the lethal grace in every movement and the cold calculation in his eyes as he tracked the intruder's progress. And when his phone buzzed, he answered with a single word that sounded more like a command than a greeting. The voices from upstairs filtered down, raised and urgent, and I heard what might have been a gunshot or might have been something else. And I pressed myself harder against the concrete wall, wishing I could disappear into it. Alexander ended his call and turned to me briefly, his expression softening just slightly, as he told me it would be over soon. They had the intruder contained, and his voice carried absolute certainty that should have comforted me, but instead made me wonder what over meant in his vocabulary. Minutes stretched like hours as we waited in that reinforced tomb. And finally his phone rang again, and he listened without speaking before saying something short and definitive that made the tension leave his shoulders fractionally. He holstered his weapon and crossed to me, reaching out to touch my face with surprising gentleness, given what had just occurred, and told me the threat was neutralized. One of Colborne's soldiers had breached the perimeter, but was now in custody. I asked what would happen to him, and Alexander's expression went carefully blank as he said they would get information, and I knew better than to ask for details about his interrogation methods, because I could hear men moving somewhere in the house, and voices that carried an edge that made my stomach twist with the knowledge of violence about to be enacted in my name. Morning came with pale light filtering through my bedroom windows, and I hadn't slept at all, just lay there listening to the sounds of the house settling back into routine after the violence of the night before, and when I finally ventured downstairs, I found Alexander in his office with the door open, looking exhausted in a way I hadn't seen before, and I stood in the doorway until he looked up and gestured me inside with an expression I couldn't read. I didn't sit, didn't want the pretense of casual conversation, and I asked him directly when this would end, my voice sharper than I intended, but I was beyond caring about politeness or diplomacy after spending hours in a concrete tomb wondering if someone was going to die because of me. He leaned back in his chair and studied me with those dark eyes that saw too much, and his answer was brutally honest in a way that made my stomach drop, saying it wouldn't end until Colburn was dealt with permanently, and the weight he put on that last word left no room for misinterpretation. I heard myself ask if he was going to kill Colborne, the question stark and terrible in the morning quiet. And Alexander didn't answer directly, but he didn't deny it either, just watched me process what that meant, and waited to see if I would break. The moral complexity crashed over me like a wave, the understanding that this man who had protected me and shown me unexpected kindness and sat beside me while I cried was also someone who would commit murder, who probably had committed murder, whose hands were capable of both gentleness and lethal violence. And I didn't know how to reconcile those contradictions, or even if I should try. He must have seen the struggle on my face because he stood and came around the desk, but stopped several feet away, giving me space, and told me quietly that I didn't have to approve of what he did, didn't have to understand or accept his choices. I only had to stay safe until it was over. I asked what happened after Colborne was dead, and the threat was gone, and I was free to leave. And something flickered across his expression too quickly for me to identify before he said, "That was my choice. He wouldn't keep me if I wanted to go." And the careful neutrality in his voice felt like armor he'd put on to protect himself from my answer. I wanted to ask if he wanted me to stay but couldn't form the words, wasn't ready to hear whatever he might say. So instead, I just stood there feeling the distance between us like a physical thing, despite only a few feet separating our bodies. He told me then that his people were working on locating Colborne, that it would be soon, maybe days, and I should prepare myself for what came next, and I understood he meant both the violence he would enact and the decision I would have to make about whether someone like me could build any kind of future with someone like him. The sun climbed higher outside the windows, and I could hear birds singing in the gardens, like the world was normal, like we were normal. And I told him I needed time to think, and he nodded once, and let me leave without trying to stop me, or convince me, or touch me in ways that would have made thinking impossible. The intel arrived late afternoon, Alexander receiving a call in his office that made his entire posture change, and I was passing by in the hallway when I saw through the open door the way his expression hardened into something cold and final, and my stomach dropped before I even knew what the call was about because I recognized that look now, the shift from man to underboss, from the person who shared quiet dinners with me to the one who commanded soldiers and made decisions about life and death. He ended the call and looked up to find me standing frozen in the doorway, and for a long moment we just stared at each other while unspoken understanding passed between us. And when he told me they had located Colborne, I felt the bottom fall out of my world, even though I'd known this was coming. Had been waiting for it since the morning conversation about permanence and choices. He said it would happen tonight. His people were already mobilizing, and the matter-of-fact way he delivered the information made it somehow worse than if he'd been dramatic or apologetic. And I heard myself say no, just that single word like it could stop what was already in motion. He stood and came toward me, and I should have backed away but couldn't move. And when he asked what I meant, I found words tumbling out about retaliation and danger, and how Colburn's people would come for him and he could be killed. And somewhere in the middle of my desperate rambling, I realized I wasn't objecting to the morality anymore, but to the risk, to the possibility of losing him. And that realization stopped me mid-sentence. Alexander was watching me with an intensity that made my skin feel too tight, and he asked quietly why I cared, what difference it made to me if he came back or not. And I opened my mouth but couldn't articulate the truth even to myself, couldn't admit that somewhere in the strange captivity of these weeks, I'd stopped seeing him as my enemy, and started seeing him as something else entirely, something dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with violence. He stepped closer and lifted one hand to cup my face, his palm warm against my cheek, and told me he'd been trying to stay away from me, trying to keep boundaries proper and respectful, because I was under his protection, and that meant something. Meant I should be safe from him too. But I made it impossible, and the raw honesty in his voice unraveled something in my chest. I admitted the attraction terrified me, that everything about this situation and him and what I was feeling terrified me because it went against everything I thought I believed about right and wrong and the kind of man I could let myself want. and he made a sound low in his throat and leaned in slowly, giving me time to pull away, and kissed me with a gentleness that contradicted everything I knew about his capacity for violence. He pulled back after a moment, searching my eyes for something, asking without words if this was what I wanted, and instead of answering, I kissed him back harder, deeper, my hands fisting in his shirt and pulling him closer because words felt inadequate for the need flooding through me. And he responded with controlled intensity that made me feel both cherished and consumed. And when we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and the space between us had fundamentally shifted into something irreversible. Alexander led me upstairs to his bedroom with our fingers intertwined, and the hallway felt impossibly long, even though it was only seconds before he closed the door behind us and turned to face me with an expression that made my breath catch, vulnerability and desire mixing in those dark eyes that had seen so much violence, but now looked at me like I was something precious. He touched my face again, thumb tracing my cheekbone with such gentleness, it made my throat tight. And when he kissed me this time, it was slower, deeper, acclaiming that I met with equal intensity as my hands slid under his shirt to feel the heat of his skin and the tension in his muscles. We undressed each other carefully, almost reverently, and when his shirt came off, I saw the full extent of what his life had written on his body, scars layering over scars, some neat surgical lines, and others ragged tears that must have been agony, and the fresh bandages on his shoulder from the wound I'd stitched in that alley a lifetime ago. I traced a particularly vicious scar across his ribs with trembling fingers, trying to imagine the pain of it, and he caught my hand and brought it to his lips, kissing my palm with such tenderness, it made my eyes sting. He laid me back on his bed like I might break, his weight settling over me in a way that should have felt threatening, but instead felt safe. And when he moved inside me, it was with a careful intensity that spoke of restraint, of him holding back his strength because he understood how easily he could hurt me and refused to do it. I touched every scar I could reach, mapping the violence of his past with my hands, while he whispered my name like a prayer. And somewhere in the tangle of limbs and sensation, I stopped thinking about right and wrong, and just felt, just existed in this moment with him. Afterwards, we lay together in the darkening room, my head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow, and his fingers traced idle patterns on my shoulder that made me shiver. He told me about his father then, voice quiet in the intimate darkness, how he'd inherited this life at 19 when the old man was killed, how he'd never wanted the crown but took it anyway to protect his sister, how every choice since had been about survival and duty rather than desire. I shared my fear of losing another person to violence, told him about the phone call that shattered my world 3 years ago, how I still heard my mother's screams sometimes in quiet moments. He tightened his arms around me and promised he would come back tonight, that Colburn wouldn't take him from me. And even though we both knew it was a promise, he couldn't guarantee I let myself believe it because the alternative was unbearable. The sun was setting outside his windows, painting everything gold and crimson, and I memorized the feel of him against me, the sound of his breathing, the way his hand felt in my hair, storing up these details against the possibility that this might be all we'd ever have. Alexander left an hour after sunset, and I watched from the bedroom window as he walked across the grounds toward the waiting vehicles, his men falling into formation around him with military precision, and the sight of him moving into operational mode made my chest constrict with fear I couldn't suppress, even though I knew he needed me to be strong. I stayed at that window long after the taillights disappeared down the tree-lined drive, my forehead pressed against the cool glass while my mind conjured every terrible possibility, every way this could go wrong and leave me shattered again by violence I couldn't control or prevent. The house felt impossibly empty despite the security team stationed throughout, their presence a reminder of the danger rather than a comfort. And I couldn't stay still, couldn't settle. So I wandered through rooms that had become familiar over these strange weeks until I found myself in the library, surrounded by his books and the scent of leather and old paper. Hours crawled past with agonizing slowness while I tried to read but retained nothing, the words blurring together as my mind stayed fixed on Alexander, walking into a situation that could kill him. And somewhere around midnight, the secure phone he'd given me rang with Dr. Thornhill's number, and I almost didn't answer because the intrusion of my real life into this surreal waiting felt jarring. She needed to discuss staffing schedules and a supply shortage at the clinic, practical, mundane concerns that seemed to belong to a different universe. And as I tried to focus on her words, I realized how much I missed that world, the straightforward morality of healing, the clear purpose of my work. The person I'd been before a wounded stranger in an alley changed everything. Catherine had sent 6 messages over the course of the evening, her worry escalating with each one, and I typed reassurances I didn't feel while guilt gnawed at me for the lies I was maintaining, for the distance I'd created between myself and everyone who actually belonged in my life. I felt trapped between 2 worlds that couldn't coexist, the nurse who saved lives and the woman waiting for a criminal to return from committing murder. And I didn't know which version of myself was real anymore, or if I could ever reconcile the two. Dawn was breaking outside the windows, pale light washing across the grounds, when I heard vehicles approaching and my heart launched into my throat as I ran through hallways toward the front entrance. Alexander came through the door looking like something from a nightmare, his shirt soaked with blood that I prayed wasn't all his face showing exhaustion and something harder, the cost of whatever he'd done written in his eyes. I cataloged injuries automatically, even as I closed the distance between us, saw the bleeding gash across his forearm and bruising already forming on his jaw. But he was alive and whole, and reaching for me with hands that trembled slightly. He pulled me against him despite the blood and said it was over. Colborne was neutralized, his crew scattered or eliminated, the threat was finished, and I should have felt relief, but instead felt the weight of what neutralized meant. The lives ended to protect mine. He held me while I processed this, his hand in my hair and his heart beating steady against my ear. And when he told me I was safe now, could go home, could return to my real life, I heard the unspoken question underneath about whether that life would include him or if this had been a temporary madness we'd both recover from. I should have felt relief when I walked back into my apartment 2 days after Alexander told me I could go home. Should have felt grateful for the way his people had erased every trace of the violation, furniture restored and walls repainted and locks upgraded, everything back to normal as if the threat had never existed. But instead, I felt hollow walking through rooms that belonged to a version of myself I couldn't quite remember how to be. The quiet felt oppressive after weeks of Alexander's presence, after falling asleep to the sound of his breathing and waking to find him watching me with an expression that made my chest ache, and I caught myself listening for his footsteps in the hallway, before remembering I was alone again, safe and protected, and utterly empty. Returning to work at the clinic should have grounded me, the familiar rhythm of triage and treatment and paperwork that had defined my identity for years. But I moved through my shifts like I was underwater, going through motions while my mind stayed fixed on Alexander's face in those final moments before I left the estate. The careful blankness that told me he was letting me go because he thought it was what I needed. My patients needed me present, but I was numb, checking vitals and administering medications with mechanical precision while Dr. Thornhill watched me with concern that she finally voiced during a quiet moment in the supply room, asking if I was all right, if the family emergency had resolved itself, or if there was something she could do. I lied and said everything was fine, heard how unconvincing I sounded, saw her decide not to push, because she knew I would talk when I was ready. Except I didn't know if I would ever be ready to explain what had happened, how saving a wounded stranger had cracked open my carefully ordered life and shown me an intensity I hadn't known existed. Catherine showed up at my apartment on the 4th night, armed with wine and determination, planted herself on my couch, and refused to leave until I told her what was actually going on, because she knew me too well to believe the family emergency story. I broke down then. told her an edited version about meeting someone and getting in too deep and having it end badly, left out the parts about organized crime and death threats, and falling in love with a man who killed people to protect what was his. She held me while I cried, didn't ask for details I couldn't give, just said she was sorry, and that whoever he was an idiot for letting me go, and I didn't correct her because how could I explain that he hadn't let me go so much as set me free? A week passed with no contact from Alexander, no messages or calls or unexpected appearances. Nothing to indicate that those weeks together had meant anything beyond a temporary arrangement born of necessity. And I told myself this was better, that I could rebuild my normal life and forget the way his hands felt on my skin and the sound of my name in his voice. The lie tasted bitter, but I repeated it anyway, tried to make myself believe it, tried to convince myself that the ache in my chest would fade with time and distance, even though some part of me knew I was only marking time until I saw him again. The night shift ended at 11, and I walked out of the clinic into October air that smelled like rain and distant smoke, my body aching with the exhaustion that came from pretending I was fine for 8 hours straight, while everything inside me felt shattered beyond repair. I pulled my jacket tighter and headed toward the subway entrance half a block away, the familiar route I'd walked 1,000 times before a wounded stranger in an alley had rewritten every assumption I'd held about my life and myself. I almost didn't see him at first, my mind too consumed with the effort of putting one foot in front of the other and not thinking about dark eyes and dangerous hands and the way my name sounded in his voice. But then I registered the figure standing near the streetlight, not beside a black car with tinted windows, but just standing there on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, and my heart stopped before launching into a rhythm that felt like it would crack my ribs. Alexander looked different in jeans and a dark sweater, the casual clothes making him seem almost ordinary, except nothing about him could ever be ordinary, not the way he held himself, or the intensity in his face, or the vulnerability I'd never seen before that made him look uncertain, almost afraid. He didn't move toward me, just watched as I stood frozen halfway between the clinic door and the subway stairs, and the distance between us felt like an ocean I didn't know how to cross, even though every cell in my body was screaming at me to run to him. He spoke first, his voice carrying across the empty sidewalk, said he'd tried to stay away, tried to let me return to my normal life and the safety of a world that didn't include men like him, but he couldn't do it, couldn't stop thinking about me, or wanting me, or needing to see me, even if it was selfish and wrong. He said he wasn't here as my protector, or because of some obligation born from the threat that had forced us together. Said he was here as a man who couldn't stop thinking about a woman and didn't know how to let her go, even though he knew he should. My walls crumbled then, all the careful distance I'd tried to maintain, and the lies I'd told myself about being better off alone. And I heard myself saying I'd been miserable too, that every day without him felt like walking through fog, that I'd been pretending to be fine while dying inside. He took a step closer, his expression shifting from uncertainty to something raw and hungry that made my breath catch. And he asked the question I'd been avoiding since the moment I walked away from the estate. Could I accept what he was, the life he led, the violence and danger and moral complexity that came with loving a man who lived outside the law? His voice was steady, but I heard the fear underneath, the expectation of rejection, and I realized he thought I would choose the safe, predictable world of my normal life over the intensity and risk of being with him. I didn't have an answer that would satisfy either of us, couldn't promise I would always be comfortable with his choices or that I wouldn't struggle with the weight of what he did, but I could tell him the truth. I said I didn't know if I could fully accept it, but I wanted to try. Wanted him enough to navigate the impossible contradictions. Wanted us enough to risk everything I'd built for a future I couldn't predict or control. We negotiated the terms of our relationship like diplomats navigating a fragile treaty, both of us aware that compromise would be required if we wanted this impossible thing to work, and I made it clear from the beginning that I wouldn't give up my job at the clinic or my apartment or the independence I'd fought so hard to maintain, even though part of me wanted to surrender to the ease of letting him absorb me into his world completely. Alexander respected my boundaries in ways that surprised me, never pushing when I said I needed space, never demanding more than I could give, showing up at my apartment with takeout after my shifts instead of insisting I come to the penthouse, learning the rhythm of my life instead of expecting me to simply adopt his. He started showing me parts of his world carefully, like someone introducing a skittish animal to unfamiliar territory, taking me to a gallery opening where I met business associates who were probably criminals, but looked like investment bankers, introducing me to his younger sister Isabel on a quiet afternoon at a cafe where she hugged me and thanked me for saving her brother's life with tears in her eyes. Meeting Isabel changed something fundamental in how I understood Alexander's choices because she was gentle and kind and studying marine biology at the university, completely removed from the violence of his world, and I saw how fiercely he protected her innocence, how every dark thing he did was to ensure she could live in the light. We navigated challenges that would have destroyed a normal relationship, his business requiring sudden absences, where I wouldn't hear from him for days, and I would lie awake terrified that he wouldn't come back. The ever-present danger that meant armed men sometimes waited outside my building or followed me to work until I learned to recognize which ones were his and which might be threats. My work grounded me when his world became too overwhelming, the familiar routine of triage and treatment reminding me who I was beneath the woman who loved a criminal, and he never asked me to choose between my calling and him, even though I knew it worried him that I insisted on working night shifts in a neighborhood that wasn't safe. Catherine eventually demanded to meet him after weeks of me deflecting her increasingly pointed questions, and I watched her study him over dinner with the suspicious protectiveness of a best friend who knew I was in deeper than I'd ever been. But by the end of the night, I saw her expression soften because she couldn't miss the way he looked at me, the careful tenderness in how he touched my hand, or the absolute focus he gave me when I spoke. Dr. Thornhill pulled me aside one morning after a shift and warned me about the consequences of getting involved with someone like Alexander, said she'd heard rumors and was worried about me, and I couldn't deny the truth of what she was saying, but I also couldn't walk away from what I'd found even knowing the risks. I told her that love wasn't safe, but it was real, that I'd spent my whole life playing it safe and avoiding risk, and it had left me half alive, that choosing Alexander meant choosing intensity and danger and uncertainty, but also choosing to feel everything instead of sleepwalking through existence. And I saw her understand, even if she didn't approve. The charity gala was being held at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel downtown, one of those glittering events where wealth and power gathered under the pretense of philanthropy, and as I stood in the ballroom, wearing a floor-length emerald gown that Alexander had insisted on buying me despite my protests about the obscene price tag, I felt like I was inhabiting two identities simultaneously, the night shift nurse from the underfunded clinic and the woman on the arm of one of the city's most dangerous men. 6 months had passed since that night outside the clinic when he'd stood on the sidewalk looking vulnerable and uncertain. 6 months of negotiating the impossible balance between my world and his. And somehow we'd made it work, even when logic said we shouldn't be able to. The gala was for the hospital expansion project, a new wing that would serve the communities I worked with. And Alexander's family had donated an amount that made my head spin. Money that came from sources I tried not to think about too carefully, but that would save lives regardless of its origin. He stayed close throughout the evening, his hand resting on the small of my back, in a touch that was protective but not possessive, letting me move freely through conversations with Dr. Thornhill and hospital administrators while remaining a steady presence at my side. I introduced him simply as Alexander, watching people's expressions shift when they recognized the name Ravenscroft, the careful politeness that came from dealing with someone whose power operated outside normal channels. And he navigated it all with effortless grace that came from a lifetime of moving between legitimate and criminal worlds. Catherine was there with her husband, and she caught my eye across the room and smiled, that knowing look that said she still worried about me, but had accepted that I'd made my choice and was happy in ways she'd never seen before. The orchestra started playing something slow and romantic, and Alexander leaned down to whisper that he had a question to ask me later. His breath warm against my ear, and my heart started racing, because I knew what that meant, even if I couldn't let myself believe it yet. We moved onto the dance floor, his arms around me, and I thought about the wounded stranger in the alley 8 months ago, how I'd almost walked past him, how one decision made in exhaustion and fear had rewritten my entire existence. He pulled me closer as we danced, surrounded by people from both our worlds, merging in this strange intersection of charity and crime, and everything complicated in between. And he said quietly that he loved me, his voice certain and steady, and full of all the things he usually kept locked away. I said it back without hesitation, meaning it despite everything, despite the danger and the moral compromises, and the fear that sometimes still woke me at 3 in the morning, because what we had was worth the cost of admission. The future stretched ahead, uncertain, and probably dangerous, full of challenges I couldn't predict, and obstacles that would test us in ways I couldn't imagine, but we would face it together, and that was enough. He kissed me there on the dance floor, tender and possessive and full of promise. And I kissed him back knowing this was just the beginning of our story, not the ending, that there would be more complications and more choices and more moments where I would have to decide if loving him was worth the price, and knowing I would choose him every single time.